Hello there, and a very warm welcome to my YouTube this evening. My name's Chris, and we're going to take a look at the Supermarine Spitfire on floats. The Spitfire is widely regarded as one of the finest fighter aircraft of the Second World War, and it served throughout that time and proved adaptable enough to evolve as the conflict raged. The Spitfires was a keystone aircraft in British and Allied air forces and was built in large numbers. As a result of this wide-scale construction and usage, the type found itself also used in a host of other roles other than as a fighter. Originally intended, it was a photo reconnaissance, meteorological, it was a carrier fighter aircraft, attack bomber. If a single-seat aircraft could do it, then the Spitfire probably did. And there was one other rather less known role that the aircraft was tried, which is somewhat ironic, as the lineage of the Spitfire runs directly from the Supermarine racing floatplanes of the pre-war years. Interest in the concept of having a seaplane variant of the Spitfire started with the German invasion of Norway on the 9th of April 1940. Both the British and French rushed troops to the country to try and confront the Germans, and one of the major issues faced by the Allies was a lack of airfields for them to operate fighters from. But what Norway did have was miles of open waterways and fjords from which seaplanes could operate. The British had in fact planned to build a floatplane variant of the Blackburn Roc before the war, but this turret fighter was barely functioning combatant in its original configuration, and the addition of heavy floats made it even more of a sitting duck. Anyway, with nothing else suitable, the British decided the best stopgap option was to see if they could convert one of their existing frontline fighters into a viable combat floatplane. Both Supermarine and Hawker were asked to examine the possibility of this with their respective Spitfires and Hurricane fighters, building test aircraft into floatplane configurations as a matter of utmost priority. To this end, the government released several sets of floats that had been built for Blackburn Rocs for trial fitting, with the understanding that should it prove successful, 50 more would be available to build the floatplane fighters. Hawker was rather dubious about whether the conversion would work on the Hurricane effectively, as especially the Blackburn Roc was a heavier aircraft than both the Spitfire and the Hurricane, and these floats designed for it were heavier and larger than needed. As the Hurricane already had an inferior performance on the Spitfire, no doubt they appreciated that at the time, when they were already working flat out, the exercise for them would prove a waste of effort. Scale model tests conducted at the Royal Aircraft establishment at Farnborough would go on to prove this, demonstrating that the Hurricane would be liable to suffer from water damage as a floatplane. The Spitfire, however, was deemed safe for actual conversion, and so Supermarine tasked the Folland Aircraft company with doing the conversion, and a single Spitfire Mk I R6772 was provided for this. Folland rapidly got the job done, and by the first week of June, R6722 was ready for flotation and taxi trials. These didn't go so well, and the aircraft, which acquired the derogatory nickname of Narvik Nightmare, was found to be very unstable in the water. Of course, the rapid and lash-up nature of the project makes this hardly surprising. Perhaps with more time, better results would have been accomplished. But while the floatplane project was proceeding rapidly, the war was moving even quicker. On the 24th of May, the withdrawal of Allied troops from Norway was approved, and France itself was collapsing to the German attack that had started 2 weeks before. Within a month, the British had been driven off the continent and France had surrendered. Now, instead of needing aircraft for offensive operations, the RAF needed every fighter it could get for home defence, and R6722 was rapidly converted back to her original configuration and posted to a combat squadron 222. But this didn't mark the end of the saga of the floatplane Spitfire. Far from it. In June 1941, the RAA was asked once again to look at the possibility and run some model tests again. Now, the proposed aircraft for use was the Spitfire Mk III, which was expected to become the new main variant. and they spent a few months working on the original test data and designing new floats. But this too fizzled out by October of that year, and once again the idea was shelved. And then Japan launched their campaign to take over the Pacific in 1941, and the possible need for a capable float plane arose yet again. This time a Mk VB was used, W3760. This aircraft had as its standard armament fitted two 20mm cannon and four .303 Browning machine guns, and instead of being lumbered with whatever floats happened to be on hand, these components were expressly designed for the purpose by Arthur Shervill of Supermarine. He had designed the floats for the original Snyder Trophy racers from which the Spitfire had evolved. W3760 was also given several additional modifications that the previous work had shown would be necessary: a ventral stabilising fin, large rudder and strengthened wing spar, and a four-bladed propeller. The conversion was completed by the latter half of 1942, and the aircraft was put through its paces in October. There were brief spells of excitement during the tests, when one of the pilots, straying from the designated safe passage of flight corridors, was engaged by the anti-aircraft defences of the city of Southampton, but fortunately he was able to evade and return to base safely. The aircraft then went for service trials in Scotland, but the floats proved to have issues with cracking and taking on water, and new ones had to be made for proper service trials. These showed that even with additional drag and the weight of floats, W3760 could make a top speed of 324 miles an hour. While this was 40 miles an hour slower than the stock Mk V, this was still considered acceptable. Surprisingly, the test pilots reported that the floatplane Spitfire retained a good bit of its original manoeuvrability of its original design, and encouraged by this, orders were given to Folland to convert two new Mk Vs, serial numbers EP754 and EP951, into floatplanes. This was quickly achieved, and the two aircraft with the newer Merlin 46 engines demonstrated top speeds of 331 miles per hour. Now, with three of the fighters on hand, the RAF decided that they might have a suitable operation for them to take part in. With the recent defeat of Axis forces in North Africa, which had occurred in May 1943, the British had launched the operation in September to seize the Greek islands. The surrender of Italy, whose troops formed a large part of the garrison on the islands, gave the British the opportunity to launch an attack to try and take the whole chain. German garrisons on the island were largely reliant on air transportation to stay supplied, and the RAF thought if they could use Spitfire floatplanes to attack them and disrupt German logistics. The idea was that the aircraft could hide amongst the many small islands in the area and use a submarine as a base. So, in October, the three Mk V floatplanes were dispatched to Egypt to undergo training and prepare for the operation, based at an RAF flying boat station on the Great Bitter Lakes. The aircraft began working up for the mission, but hit a snag when it was found that W3760 was suffering from severe corrosion to her rear fuselage. Indeed, the salt waters of the lakes was not exactly ideal for the aircraft, but by November the mission was scrubbed. Anyway, because the Germans, acting with great decisiveness, defeated the British invasion. I really hope you found that short film of some interest. And really, by the end of 1945, the various projects to convert Supermarine Spitfires onto floats had come to an end. The aircrafts, they never really entered full operational service, but it was an interesting episode towards the end of the Second World War. Please have a ponder about subscribing, and I'll look forward to seeing you on my next film. Take the greatest of care. All the best. Cheers for now.